What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. Larry Rifkin and John Kropsic. Good day to you, sir.
Hey, how are you today?
I am fine, thank you. We're going to be talking about a topic that lots of people have kind of noodled around the edges on, and they've been a little concerned about whether the liberal arts education that kids are getting in college today really represents a full, robust palette of ideas and thinking, or whether in fact we're crowding out some of the ideas that seem somewhat objectionable to the young mind, John.
Well, I think it's certainly good for the colleges. I'm not sure if it's good for the people who are getting them these days.
Now, why do you think it's good for the colleges?
Well, because they're rolling in the dough.
Oh.
I mean, let's face it, we talked about this on another podcast about especially master's programs. But you know, all my kids, none of them got 4 years. There was always some screw up or something where they had to go for the fifth year.
Really?
Yeah. So
That's so expensive.
The colleges want to keep you as long as they can. So no matter what, and I don't think colleges are doing enough to really look at what's out there and what are, coaching these kids, or, have good guidance counselors to know if this is something that you can use and actually make money from and actually profit from after you pay your college off.
Well, I've got to say that the ideas that we're going to really be discussing in these next two podcasts really relate more to what is a liberal arts education. Now, we can argue whether making certain that everybody has a liberal arts education is a good thing or not, given the highly specialized and technical fields that today seem to dominate the realm. So you've got to go into computer science or engineering or what have you. The good old college liberal arts degree, first of all, is it worth the time? And I would still make the argument that if you're getting exposure to a lot of ideas, to a rich history, to philosophy, that those are ultimately applicable to the real world at some point. Now, you may have to go on and become more specialized over time or be trained by a company or an industry or whatever it may be. But the question that we're going to ponder today, John, is whether, in fact, they are getting that full menu of ideas, or whether, in fact, the parents today want to protect their children to such an extent that they are really limiting what they hear, that they don't want to hear ideas that may be oppositional to things that they have been taught early on in the family. They rebel against certain speakers who come onto campuses, and it makes it really hard to figure out whether something that was said by a great philosopher in the 17th or 18th century can hold muster in our politically sensitive world today.
No, you're right. This is important. And, I agree with you. I think the degree, I think just colleges have become too expensive, and they're not really giving kids the good information going in. I agree with you. Liberal arts, having a good rounded education is good. I agree with you. I just think the cost of college is getting prohibitive.
Well, the question then becomes, well, if you are going to spend that money, what do you want your young person to come out with?
Right.
And whether, in fact, they even come out with a real liberal arts degree or not is a question, or whether they come out with something that was tailored too carefully to conform to conventional thinking today and not challenging ideas. To me, I don't know if I'm an absolutist when it comes to the First Amendment. I mean, we've had Floyd Abrams on our podcast, and I will say that I'm pretty close to an absolutist, meaning bring on all ideas. They may be objectionable. They may be abhorrent. They may be despicable. But let me hear them and let me refute them not by pushing them aside, but by debating them, arguing with them, and having a real exchange of ideas to call out how callow those ideas may be.
Oh, I wish that would happen. You're absolutely right. I like your concept there. How do we get back to that? Is
Well,
the question.
that's the question.
Hopefully these authors will help us.
Well, the
move in
first
that
author
direction.
that we have on today to talk about this is Greg Lukianoff, and he's a very impressive guy. He's a liberal, but he has very grave concerns that certain liberalism isn't quite as liberal as it should be when it's about allowing ideas into the academic realm. And he's written the book, along with a co-author, The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. So we really want to hear this. Very thoughtful guy, and I want to bring him to you today here on America Trends. Greg Lukianoff is with us, and he and Jonathan Haidt have written a book called The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. Well, why don't we start with the outline of the book in terms of what is it that we have intended to do, and yet we have fallen short, and that these are turning into such bad ideas on our college campuses.
Well, the premise of the book, I've been working on campuses defending freedom of speech for pretty much my whole post-law school career. And the mystery was what was different about the incoming class of 2013, 2014 in higher education. That's when you really started seeing, trigger warnings, microaggression policies, real uptick in disinvitations, and it really seemed like it happened overnight. And the premise of our original article called Coddling the American Mind, which we wrote in 2015, was that it was as if we were giving a generation of kids and students the worst possible advice imaginable. And, we wrote this in 2015, and then, of course, everything got much, much worse. So the book is really about going much deeper into the topic of what that bad advice consists of, how we're miseducating a whole generation, and the harms it's actually having on them.
Well, for many, many years, people have thought of college campuses as being liberal bastions. You identify yourself as being a liberal and a defender of the First Amendment. So where are they in conflict right now?
Right now, it's been, when I worked for the ACLU in the late 1990s, already by then in certain circles, I was criticized for being a First Amendment defender. Because it was kind of among a certain set of people on the left, the First Amendment was a problem because it prevented you from having hate speech codes, for example. And so I ran into this a lot when I was working for the ACLU of San Francisco, and was kind of shocked. I thought being pro-freedom of speech was quintessential, what it meant to be a liberal. And unfortunately for my career, it does seem that the sort of anti-free speech wing of the left is gaining traction, whereas people like me, who are old school civil liberties people, are losing. Frankly, we're becoming less of a force. So looking at what's going on campus, it's been unfortunate to see students sort of equate freedom of speech with, and I talk about the three Bs: the bully, the banker, and the robber baron. The bully, the bigot, and the robber baron are the three things that I usually say. And unfortunately, what we saw in 2013, the real shift, the reason why we saw it so different, was suddenly so different, was that the excuses or the reasons given for supporting students' censorship were medicalized. They were not just saying that I think this person is racist or offensive. They're saying that if this person is allowed to speak on my campus, my friends over here will be actually
traumatized,
psychologically harmed by it, and that was new.
When we look at these terms that you're using in terms of trigger warnings, microaggressions, now you dabble in this all the time. Help the rest of us understand what that means.
Sure. Okay, so microaggressions are the one I always like to address first, partially because I actually take microaggressions very seriously. Now, what are they? Microaggressions are tiny, or small, usually unintentional slights by which you sort of put down people, usually in a racist and sexist manner. And it's kind of funny because people have actually written things saying like Lukianoff and Haidt don't believe in microaggressions, and we're like, of course we believe in microaggressions. Of course we believe that you can unintentionally insult people even while trying to do your best. And this was a concept that dates all the way back to the 1970s. But it wasn't a very popular concept on campus until, I'd say, the 2013-2014, where it really took on a life of its own. And for those of us who are First Amendment defenders, we know how this story goes. You take something that's originally well-intentioned, maybe even has sort of a little bit of an academic sheen to it, but as soon as you turn it into policy, you end up with absurdities like the University of California system defining microaggressions to include statements as, every day as, quote-unquote, America is a land of opportunity, or, quote-unquote, I think the most qualified person should get the job, or, quote-unquote, America is a melting pot. And this is no surprise to those of us who defend First Amendment because, restrictions on speech are a slippery slope. But it's interesting to see this a tool that was originally intended to draw attention to how we can be unintentionally unkind to each other very quickly gets transformed in a way of shutting down discussion.
What is a trigger warning?
Trigger warnings. Now, trigger warnings are really kind of punch above their weight in terms of how seriously people take trigger warnings. Trigger warnings are essentially usually little verbal warnings that you give, usually in class, to say, trigger warning, we're going to deal with a book, we're going to talk about a book that has a graphic sexual assault in it. Basically a way of preparing your students for that they're going to read something that might be upsetting, but put in the language of post-traumatic stress syndrome, which can and if you genuinely have PTSD, you can be medically triggered by something that gives you flashbacks of a trauma that you experienced. Trigger warnings were they're almost like a hot idea back when we originally wrote the article back in 2015. They definitely hold more of the public imagination than I think they actually exist in practice. Most schools, I've only seen one or two schools try to actually impose trigger warnings on professors. Oberlin was one of them, and Oberlin, even the professors at Oberlin went, no way. Like, we can't possibly warn people about every offensive possible thing we could say in class. But trigger warnings, once again, something that, started with a good intention, but it leads to this sort of unrealistic belief that you could essentially bubble wrap the world.
Well, how many tenets of Western philosophy and literature would be ruled out of bounds as a result of what you began seeing in 2013, 2014?
Oh, my goodness. The Oberlin policy is particularly instructive to look at that because they don't just recommend professors use trigger warnings. They recommend that professors flat out avoid anything that could be, and the list just goes on. It starts with, of course, racist and sexist, but then it goes to cis-normative, as in people who aren't transgender, classist, just ist after ist after ist. And then looking at the list, you're like, well, what on earth doesn't touch on any of these topics? I mean, like maybe pure mathematics doesn't, but other than that, how on earth is a professor supposed to teach their class if they can't actually discuss anything that touches on these topics?
Is there anything that you think in the discourse of an academic career and just the entanglement of ideas that is out of bounds? I mean, that is appropriately avoided because it really is offensive.
I don't really think it is, but that's partially because I look at academic freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of inquiry in a what might be called either a radical or even old-fashioned kind of way, that essentially you should be able to deal with arguments in which people play devil's advocate, for example, even for horrible things. Mm-hmm. If you really want to understand the world in which we live, that has included genuine evil, you have to figure out where it comes from. You have to figure out what leads to it and what kind of situations either cultivate it or decrease it. So, for example, people will bring up kind of like, well, surely, professors shouldn't be teaching Hitler's Mein Kampf. And, of course, if you're a student of 20th century German history, you have something written by one of the greatest murderers in history that's more or less a mission statement on what he's going to do, that trumpets his anti-Semitism, as loudly as he possibly can. And of course you should read it. It's a primary source document. And somewhere along the lines, it's as if we got mixed up that saying, yeah, requiring someone to read something does not mean they agree with it. It's just saying that it's part of the historical record that any thoughtful person should be able to know and not be devastated by its mere existence.
I mean, how can we go back to any of the books written in the 30s, the 20s, the 40s, the 50s that didn't understand where we are today in terms of marriage of the same sex or whatever it may be that we've grown to understand and appreciate as part of a cultural norm, but it wasn't at that time? Then how can you rule any of those books in when they predated some of our common knowledge today?
And unless you to a degree sort of get over your own sort of temporal biases, that you might be a true believer in all the norms of academia in 2018, it would make it very difficult for you to go back and all the essentially sort of politeness and propriety norms. It makes it very difficult to actually go back and look at these writers and not come away saying these people are hopelessly problematic and racist and sexist. And that may be true, but nonetheless, if you want to actually live in the real world and study history and know what the world is actually like, that's going to be kind of uncomfortable sometimes.
Well, looking at the founders of this country would
Sure.
be very difficult. I mean, we hold them up as being, really enlightened people for their age. But then we have to put that into a context. They weren't around in 2018. We don't know what their political views would be today.
Yeah, well, I mean, Thomas Paine, Thomas Paine's Age of Reason, written in the 1790s, and, writing the foreword while he's actually in jail during the French Revolution, is a book that can still offend people like crazy today. And I read it kind of thinking that maybe it was some kind of like, maybe it was just our modern norms projecting backwards. How shrill could it be? And it's pretty shrill. I was like, okay, I get it. But at the same time, this is Thomas Paine. This is an incredibly influential writer, incredibly influential thinker. And the fact that it makes you uncomfortable to read it is no reason not to read it.
The book is called The Coddling of the American Mind. It all began as an article, a cover piece in Atlantic several years ago, and the response that you got was even greater, I think, and perhaps more positive from many of the professors who themselves feel as if they have some shackles on.
Yes, and that's created a real conflict on campus. Is that professors who might have at one point had, to some degree, understandable sympathy for speech codes as a way to prevent racist and sexist speech, which is kind of the way they're marketed, but they end up going always well beyond that. Started to see that some of these students who they thought they shared common beliefs with were actually ones that could be reporting them to the administration or the bias-related incident team the next day. So we've definitely seen some real mobilization among even professors who very much consider themselves on the left, coming both to FIRE, my organization, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, and to my co-author's organization, Jonathan Haidt's, the Heterodox Academy, because they are starting to get, and for years now, they've been getting a lot more anxious that that what you say in a classroom is increasingly a minefield.
So do we find that a lot of professors today are being criticized, excoriated, their tenure threatened, or anything of that nature because they have not stayed within these speech codes?
I see a lot of cases like that at FIRE. Sometimes the professors aren't willing to fight, and I sometimes try to give them a pep talk that if they don't actually fight one of these small encroachments or one of these small charges, it's just going to get worse and worse. And sadly, in a lot of cases, those professors are still not willing to fight. But in recent years, we've seen tenured professors, both right and left, get in trouble for what they said, both inside and outside of class. And thankfully, there have been some big victories on this. There was a Professor John McAdams at Marquette University, a private school, was fired for reporting that a professor didn't want to discuss gay marriage in a debate class because it would be offensive. But this is interesting, of course, because this is at a nominally Catholic college. Professor McAdams complained about this, basically making the point that we can't take a Catholic point of view in a Catholic college. And they ended up firing him partially because his tweet, which was, and his blog, which was absolutely protected speech under the standards of the First Amendment, produced a lot of outrage. It got out into the conservative blogosphere and produced a lot of hate mail for Marquette and the professor who originally said that they couldn't have that in debate class. But their response was to fire the professor. And after one successful bite at the apple going to court, he finally was vindicated by the appeals court level. So professors who decide to fight this can and do often win, oftentimes with fire's help.
You say that young people today are fragile as a group. How did you get to that place? Who's responsible for it? Are there the helicopter parents? Is that the situation that you're finding with Gen X parents? And then where does cognitive behavioral therapy, which you and your co-author talk about, where does that fit in to dealing with this fragility?
Well, one thing I always like to clarify, and we say this in the book, is that we don't think that students or young people are naturally fragile. We think they're naturally anti-fragile, and that's Nassim Taleb's term for systems, organisms that benefit from stressors. That essentially, if you train someone to live with challenge and to push themselves, they can really achieve great things. But if you create a circumstance in which their expectation is that they should never be offended, you actually do them harm when they try to actually deal with the normal rigors of everyday life and everyday study. So I think that what we're doing is we're essentially lying to a generation about their own anti-fragility and their own resilience, and creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that results in students with skyrocketing rates of anxiety, depression, and unfortunately, according to the stats, suicide. Where cognitive behavioral therapy comes in is that I'm a big believer in CBT as a therapy, and what CBT is looking at the more exaggerated narratives you have in your head. Like when something mildly bad happens and you say, "Oh, my life is over." That's a cognitive distortion. That's called catastrophizing. And it's amazing that one of the most successful interventions for anxiety and depression is just to get yourself in the habit of talking back to those voices. You probably know people who have benefited from CBT. But that's it as a therapy. In the book and in the article, one thing that I propose is that the methods of sort of talking back to the exaggerated, unfair thoughts are actually also good rules for how you argue with other people, too. So in a way, in the book, what we're trying to do is reintroduce the idea of rational discourse, both showing how you can have rational arguments with yourselves and eliminate kind of unfair arguments with yourself can make you happier. But also, when you're arguing with other people, don't catastrophize, don't overgeneralize, don't label. If we could all learn to exercise some of these arguments of good debate and discussion, I think it could do worlds of help for both our universities and, for that matter, our political state.
Well, the whole notion that just because you're paranoid doesn't mean somebody's not coming after you.
Right.
Michael Roth, who is the president of Wesleyan University in the state, it's in Connecticut, where we come from and where we are now talking to you. The question is, he in a review of your book asked, but are students today disempowered because they've been convinced they're fragile, or did they feel vulnerable because they are facing problems like climate change and massive, nasty inequality? Now, he asked that question, and I'll ask another question, which is, when we see where we are in the era of Donald Trump, do they have a reason to push back in a very aggressive way against ideas that they think are primitive or are uninformed?
Well, none of these threats necessarily make people fragile. They can make them angry, and a healthy response to political action that you think is regressive or harmful is to be angry. But nobody benefits from an activist class that is depressed and anxious and with rising suicide rates. And also it's important to remember that a lot of these trends began before anybody thought Donald Trump could ever in a jillion years be president. We noticed that these shifts starting to take place in 2013, 2014. Now, in the book, we do say that there are reasons to be anxious, but we shouldn't pretend as if there weren't tremendous reasons for every generation to be anxious and afraid. I mean, I was growing up in the early 1980s. I was being told over and over again by different kinds of intellectuals that nuclear war was pretty much a certainty. It was going to happen. Enjoy your life while it lasts. My dad grew up in Yugoslavia during the Nazi occupation. It's not as if we're living in an age of unparalleled danger. Now, the point some of the points that I definitely do give to students, is I find the level of debt that you have to accumulate to go to college, I would find that very anxiety-inducing. Indeed, even though my debt level was much, much lower many years ago, I still found it incredibly anxiety-producing. But a lot of these stresses are the kind of things that every generation faces in one way or another, and it's not helpful to them, to the activists themselves, or to the communities they live in, if these become tools that actually lead to disempowering anxiety and depression.
Is a liberal arts education possible today if, in fact, we're exempting a lot of speech that might make people anxious, or because of the fragility that has been kind of fostered upon them perhaps by their parents, that they can't handle some of that information? What is a liberal arts education, in effect?
Yeah, it's one of these things. There's been a lot of, depending on how bad people think it has gotten on campus, there can be a lot of sort of throwing up hands and there's nothing to be done, and that with these attitudes with regards to speech, you can't have a liberal education. I think that it's too early to start thinking that way. I think that universities, for example, most universities don't even explain at orientation freedom of speech, academic freedom, freedom of inquiry, and these are sophisticated concepts that you have to be more or less prepared that education, if done correctly, is going to be at times even emotionally difficult. But if you're not teaching a generation this, and instead your orientation focuses more on something that ends up sounding to them more like you have a right not to be offended, you're setting yourself up for failure. So I think that there are many things, and about a third of the book is dedicated to lots of what we think of as relatively easy things. Both colleges can do, K through 12 can do, parents can do, that actually prepare students for the fact that they should actually be welcoming the challenge of an education rather than figuring out ways why nobody should have.
In many ways, as you went along in this book, it became something of a self-help book. Do you think that there are certain colleges and universities today, given the fact that they really do need to attract students, and maybe there are some students and parents who say, I want you to be challenged, I want you to hear things that might be uncomfortable. Is this going to be a selling point, whereas now some of the pushback might be because colleges really want that $60,000 to $70,000 tuition?
Yeah, one thing that has been a good positive feedback loop is watching how University of Chicago, which took a stand against, really putting out a very strong statement in 2015, more or less saying, education done right is not going to be comfortable. You should understand that at the get-go. We will not disinvite speakers because someone doesn't want to hear them. They issued this wonderful statement written by some of their top legal scholars. And the good news for Chicago is not only was it well accepted, off campus at least, admissions have gone up. Donors are pleased with it. It does seem to help. Would it be one of the reasons why we don't see a lot of free speech abuses at University of Chicago? And what we hope to is really praise universities that do that and create a sort of virtuous cycle. And at this point, there are about 48 schools in the country that have passed some version of the Chicago statement.
Oh, really?
So I think that it's way too early for people to be fatalistic about it, and there are real benefits to schools that decide to embrace a rigorous idea of academic freedom, free speech, and free expression.
Greg Lukianoff, I want to thank you so much for being here today on America Trends, the coddling of the American mind. If somebody would like to get in contact with you or FIRE, how can they do that?
You can find me at thefire.org. I'm also at Lukianoff on Twitter. I'm pretty easy to find. Also, if you can spell my name, that is.
Okay, it's Lukianoff, but you can see that on the write-up that we have on our website. Thank you again for being with us today, Greg.
Thank you so much for having me.